This is an author meets critic session. We've been told that we are being live streamed, so we hope this is the case. So today we are, Tobias is presenting his book, Revaluing Workers Toward a Democratic and Sustainable Future, that he edited together with Todd. And we have three discussants, Karen Shire, who is Professor of Comparative Sociology and Japanese Society at the University of Duisburg-Essen, Peter Turnbull, who is a Professor of Management at University of Bristol, whose work is predominantly in the industrial relation arena, especially in the aviation sector, so he'll have a lot to tell us about. He would have a lot to tell us about what is happening in the airports right now, I guess. And then Ayan Meer here, who is a PhD candidate in political economy in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the MIT. So we decided to structure the session as following. So I assume that you all read the book extensively, etc. But just in case you haven't, Tobias is presenting the book very briefly, like 10 minutes introduction, something like that, 15 minutes, and then we'll leave the floor to the discussant, who have maximum 10 minutes for their comments. I don't know whether they have PowerPoint presentations or not, but then after Tobias' presentation, I would invite them just to come up, maybe and sit here, and we can use these mics, I think. We try, at least, just for the live stream. And then we'll obviously let Tobias reply to the harsh criticism, and then we'll open to your questions and comments. Okay, so Tobias, if you want to come and start.
So thanks everyone for being here. Hopefully I can keep this short. So this book was published, I don't know, 7-8 months ago, the end of 2021. A couple book reviews have appeared. There's some criticism out there. We'll see how it plays out today. I'll actually mention some of that criticism. The book is called Revaluing Workers, and there are these parentheses, so it's revaluing work itself and the people performing it. And the goal is toward a democratic and sustainable future. So this is how the book looks. It's the 2021 research volume for the Labor and Employment Relations Association, that once used to be the Industrial Relations Association in the US. And the book is a product of that association and of the department in which I am. I'm situated at Rutgers University's Labor Studies and Employment Relations Department. It's available through Cornell, and as I will gladly share chapters, and there's also a few of the chapters are available as working papers, so it's like really easy to get access to it. This book will be followed this year by another book by our department on essentially a critical take on industrial relations and particularly engagement with critical race theory intersectionality. So this has also been kind of developing these books has been somewhat of a collective endeavor at our department. So this book, number 2 here, or second point, is it tries to develop, and I think it does develop. You can judge if it's sufficient or develops it well. It tries to develop a labor studies perspective on the future of work. And it does so on the basis of a dissatisfaction with the discourse on the future of work as it is in the US. Finds itself, and then particularly the mainstream discourse. It doesn't mean in some lefty circles there are different discourses, but the discourse as we can see it in the media and in most of the social science disciplines. And I organized this Author Meets Critics session to see if there are intellectual synergies across the boundaries of different organizations. So this is with SASE. We also did a panel at the International Labor Process Conference, and we did I think we did a doctoral workshop with CRIMT, another forum that this research network for which this panel was organized is affiliated with. And it's not a purely academic book. So, I mean, the focus here is on what kind of academic concepts are necessary to build a human-centered future. So it's not just an ivory tower, let's understand the world, it's also about how we can actively shape the world. So the book is shaped by its context. I already said a few things. I said it's targeted at the mainstream future of work research, the future of work discourse. It is a product of the Labor and Employment Relations Association. And I'm already saying here, by mentioning LERA, this is an IR organization, and my department is supposed to be labor studies and employment relations. So in Europe, that might not be much of a difference, labor studies and industrial relations. In the US, it is. Labor studies is really, comes out of the critical engagement, the dissatisfaction with mainstream IR, late 60s, the birth of Black studies, Chicano studies, labor studies. So the focus on the experience of underprivileged populations. This in labor studies is the class-based studies field. The goal, as I already mentioned, is about shifting the narrative. So it's trying to radiate out narrative on the future of work. But at the same time, it tries to do a statement on labor studies. And that also implicitly means labor studies vis-a-vis IR. I mean, that we could, maybe not vis-a-vis, maybe merging with IR. That's like one discussion we have had with some colleagues. Is it the same as IR, or what is actually different? And how should we think of the boundary? So the focus is on, the book has a certain, I call it performance profile. You can criticize the book in many ways, and I would just encourage people to criticize it or to try to engage with the book on what it's trying to do. It might totally fail at that, but I hope it doesn't. But it comes with some obvious drawbacks, which are due to the context. And drawbacks if you judge it by disciplinary debates. So it focuses on the demonstration of the possibility of a different future, the integration of different knowledge and articulation of this perspective. It links the economic, political, and ecological challenges that we face. And it also has a pretty big emphasis, first of all, on exploring gender and race within the discussion of class, and secondly, also showing what engaged research can do across disciplines, but also with and within society. So some of the things that you could find in the book as maybe not up to your proclivities, it focuses on the US within the context of the global north. There's very little else on the rest of the world, and Jason Jackson is sitting here, and the other discussant, they're writing a piece complementing the book with that perspective. It also focuses its criticism on neoliberalism than on capitalism. If we had published a book criticizing capitalism in the US, nobody's going to listen to us, but intellectually it's somewhat disappointing. There's very little on the details of processes of revaluation, how that would actually work, because then it would be more contentious and I couldn't manage all the contributors. So focused on labor that we talk very little about capital, probably not so possible. And lastly, for some people it might be somewhat on a too general level, but maybe we have even more criticisms today. I just want to say that I'm aware of some of those things, that some of those things flow out of decisions that we have made. So the contrast that motivates the book is democratic capitalism is in question. It's challenged in multiple crises, ecological, political, economic. But on the other hand, the discourse we have seems to not reflect that. The discourse we have mainstream in the US, that discourse exhibits technological and market determinism. So this book, first of all, defines the core of labor studies as constituted by three propositions. The first is we focus on worker struggles as a focus of engagement with the working world. That can be individual, can be collective, but the worker and the experiences are at the center. There's an appreciation of the benefits of multidisciplinarity and the messiness of multidisciplinarity. And three, there is a normative commitment to the dignity of work and workers. And that is developed on the basis of saying that we can't really have social sciences without any normative commitments. It is these three, and this is largely in a chapter that I wrote, it's developed against the background of neoliberalism in society and disciplinary economics. And there is some discussion about how labor studies thinks about justice, and also how economics thinks about distributive justice, and there's some discussion about, fair allocation. In economics, it's about allocation on the basis of prior endowment. So there's also an implicit normative agenda here. And in engaging with other social sciences, we try to lift that up and try to be open about it and try to define it as much as possible. There are three core arguments that objectively Todd, Vachon, and I as co-authors put on the book. They're not so pulled through the chapters, but I think all of them speak to these three core arguments. The one is that the future, if we wanted the future to be sustainable and democratic, then the reevaluation of work is critical, and that process of reevaluating will have to be a collective endeavor. It can't be, and it's both societal and in working and in the workplace involving workers, laborers. That leads to the second point, that it's collective political action is central. And three, that reproductive work, that is the labor efforts from care to education that sustain the reproduction of society, that's actually a crucible for the innovation regarding valuation of work and workers, and that can radiate out more. The book has framing chapters, chapter 1, 2, and 14, and these are available as working papers. Then there's three parts. The first part is developing a labor studies perspective. We have contributions here by historians, labor geographer, and a particular engagement with environmental studies. The second part looks at evolving forms of collective action. Chapter 6 is on the importance of looking adopting a race-conscious lens. Number 7 is by practitioners, and this is also something, well, at least the first one, Joel Yudkin is a practitioner. That's important too to understand. LERA in the US it's conceptualized as a practitioner academic organization. It's not just purely academic, so it was important to bring some practitioners into. Chapter 8 is about the evolution of collective bargaining toward bargaining for the common good and sectoral bargaining, and bringing these two reform initiatives together. And here we have Erica Smiley. She is, I think, the executive director for Jobs with Justice, contributing to that chapter. Then chapter 9 is on labor education, but these are all about how collective labor action can evolve, and then parts of it. And the third part, before the concluding chapter, is about reproductive work and institutional change there as a crucible of innovation. There is something on care work, domestic work. There is something on graduate student organizing. We think about education as part of the care economy. There's something about collaborative school reform and elevating the voice of teachers in the production of education. And there's also something on skilling and labor market education policy as not just as a segmentation strategy for labor, but as empowering workers. And here's some links for the different working papers. That's it.
Awesome. Okay, so I would say that maybe it makes sense if the discussants come up and like sit here in the front. Tobias, where are you going? You can also stay here if you are comfortable with it, so that you are already here to address all the comments. Awesome. So I'll go in the order of the program. So I'll let Karen maybe start, then Peter, and then Ayan. All right, and I'll give you the mic. Otherwise, yeah.
I'm Karen Shire from the University Duisburg-Essen in Germany, and I've taken the exact opposite route of Tobias in my career. I'm educated in the United States and work in Germany. He's from Germany and now works in the United States. So this book was very fascinating to me because it's the perspective of a German who knows what a public university, publicly funded and publicly missioned university system means, and now he's working in a publicly missioned university in the US and reflecting on what's wrong with university education, and I think this is a really important topic for all of us because in the end, we're all educators and we're all members of universities, and we need to think about our position in our disciplines, our position in our universities, our commitments vis-a-vis our students, and of course, the social impact and social reach of our research. So I read this book with really great interest, and I think it will be read more than most of the books we read, because even if you're not a labor studies person, there's so much in this book that is a reflection about what education means, especially in the 21st century. Specifically, it's a book that's challenging the way that the future of work is debated within the United States, and I would say not only in the United States, as something that will grow the economy and as something that is technologically determined, and engineers and experts of all kinds are influencing these debates about the future of work without very much consideration at all about the people who are doing the work and what kind of impact it has not only on them in their everyday working lives, but also on their livelihoods, on their families, on their communities. We could say with Polanyi on the future of society itself, and on the reproduction of life itself. And in that sense, it's a very deep debate that's being picked up in this book, and I appreciated it very much. It's countering specifically, as Tobias said, a neoliberal take on economic growth and a technological take on technological transformations or the impact of technology on work. It goes to great extremes to criticize the field of economics. That was a little bit funny for me. You may know I'm here coordinator of Network G, labor markets, education, and human resources, where we actually have a lot of economists, labor economists involved, and we try very hard to make a dialogue between labor economists. And this morning we were in a session together where I said, too, that I haven't given up on economists. But nonetheless, I understand the arguments he's making. At the same time, I would argue that we could make similar arguments about our other disciplines, and that comes a little bit too short. We have, let's say, developments in sociology where only articles published in the top 5 journals that are quantitative and use fancy data techniques are what's valued. The same developments are happening in political science. So I wouldn't want to overemphasize this criticism on economics without looking at disciplines in general and how the academy is forcing them through metrics, et cetera, to develop in a very monolithic, homogeneous way. But that also underscores, I think, why labor studies as an object is important as a form of critique, because it is such an interdisciplinary field and it does encourage dialogue in a different way. That this might be a way, in fact, to reflect on what's happening in disciplines at large and not only on economics. So not only do we have to push Piketty forward, we have to push a few other figures in our disciplines forward. That said, I wondered also about whether labor studies has this real privileged position within the book. And as somebody who does a lot of work on gender studies, my first kind of thought was, why not gender studies instead of labor studies or with labor studies? And of course, why not post-colonial studies instead of labor studies or with labor studies? And of course, the book deals with gender, it deals with gender inequalities and critical race theory, but it overstates, I think, the extent to which labor studies is in the center of this, and I suppose that has to do with the fact that you're in a labor studies department and you want to develop that field. But as somebody who's in gender studies, I thought, well, there's a lot about labor studies that actually ignores a lot about gender inequalities, and it's not just a matter of revaluing care work, et cetera. It's also about the real symbolic and physical violence that women and sexual minorities face in the workplace or in attaining any kind of leadership positions. Also, although you talk about unpaid and informal work, there's a sense in which it's not really, labor studies is more or less ignored work outside of the paid workforce. And I think there is some lip service, I would almost say, to this, but especially if we look from a post-colonial or a gender perspective, then issues of unpaid work and informal work become more important. I very much appreciated the emphasis in the book on revaluing work and workers. What I thought could come out a little bit more forcefully is the real transformations in employment relations that are underway, that it's no longer just a matter of waged labor. It's what I would call a development where people are not just going out in a labor market and selling their labor, but they're being sold, whether in the form of temporary agencies or platforms, or in some cases, real forms of forced labor. And this gets also into issues of migrant labor that I think could have come a little bit more to the forefront. And I do agree a little bit with the criticism about ignoring capital, especially in the part that's about climate change, because I think it's not just a matter of the environmental, of kind of, making climate-friendly jobs or climate-friendly growth. Carbon capital is a real force to contend with, and they're lobbying all of our politicians from the left to the right, and also trying to capture the voice of trade unions, and I think opposing that is a very big job. But these are all very minor criticisms of a book that I think can be understood as a manifesto in many ways for the future. And we have this whole field now in sociology about the sociology of the future, and to get there, we have to imagine the future, and I think this book does that in a very, very nice way. So I found also the individual chapters very nice writing style, more essay than the usual deep documented sociology or political science or economics that we're all used to. So I can encourage you to read this book. I think you'll enjoy it very much on your summer holidays.
Yeah, thanks. I'll start with a couple of confessions. I'm an economist. And also, when you read books like this, when you're obviously not as kind of invested in another system, you tend to read it through the lens of your own country and kind of what you can learn from that in terms of... So some of my comments are, in many respects, driven by that kind of perspective. I think the most important thing is that the book addresses what's this kind of really fundamental and important question that we face at the moment, which is how we develop a sustainable future given the economic, political and environmental challenges that we face, and the idea that we need a kind of a solution to all those different things. If you were just in the debate about Brexit in the other room, there was the point made about the two-party system in the UK as a first-past-the-post system, and that forces the two main political parties to try to play to different audiences. And the point was made that the UK is really it should be like a nine-party kind of political system. And I think there's a lot in that, the idea that you need these kind of political solutions if you're going to get economic solutions as well. I think the kind of big question in the book about these kind of interlocking and mutually reinforcing crises in the economy, in politics and the environment, has also been thrown into really sharp relief by COVID as well. And I think that really brings things out to the fore. But also, I think there are some, if you can use the word positives, I don't know whether we can, but one of the positive things that comes out of Brexit, for example, of COVID, for example, is that the idea that the state can do things. Having been told that we've got to leave things to the market, all of a sudden, somebody finds a shoebox with millions and millions of pounds, billions of pounds to pay for furlough and all kinds of things that, to support workers. And also as well, what we've also had as well is a recognition by employers that they have to look after people's health at work. And that's been recognised by the International Labour Conference this year at the meeting of the ILO. After the employers resisting that for quite some time, and not willing to recognise that as a fundamental right at work. So there are a couple of changes that I think that are quite important in the current context that, in a sense, give us some hope for a bit more leverage for some of the things that are discussed in the book. I think for me the book does two really important things. The first is it offers a critique of, as Tobias said, the dominant thinking on the economy in general and technological change in particular. And I think secondly what it does, it lays down a challenge to academics to do more to try to uphold workers' rights, to engage with the challenges facing the labour movement in terms of intersectionality, race, sex, the extractive economy, reproductive labour, all those kind of debates. I think that's a really important contribution. And I'll just say something about the latter first, because it really threw up an interesting contrast for me between North America and, say, the UK, where we can perhaps learn from the experience of the USA. And it comes back to this thing about centering labour studies in this, the point that was just made in the previous discussion. And there's that kind of criticism of industrial relations in the book for being kind of cooperative and kind of across kind of class divides, and I think that's certainly something that we recognise in the UK in in the kind of dominant pluralist perspective and the kind of Oxford School of Industrial Relations, and I think highlighting those kind of key features of labour studies, that kind of worker-centric approach, the multidisciplinary approach, the fact that it's kind of normatively anchored. And promoting dignified work for all. I thought that was interesting as well, that I don't know how deliberate it was to talk about dignified work rather than decent work. Because again, if you look at the debates at the International Labour Organization talking about decent work, it's a very kind of slippery concept. Whereas I think we understand what dignified works, more clearly. And I think those are, in the UK, those are the kind of things that we recognise, and I don't think we have that hard and fast distinction that you try to make between labour studies and industrial relations. But having spent some time at both Cornell and Rutgers, one of the things that struck me was the kind of institutional links that the universities have with the labour movement. Whereas in the UK, it seems to be much more based around individual scholars doing work with the labour movement. And especially in terms of what's happened to industrial relations in the UK, with the closure of industrial relations departments and the kind of field being more kind of dispersed. David and I were talking about this previously. David's talked about this in the kind of the death of industrial relations by 1,000 cuts, that people retire and they're not replaced by similar kind of scholars. We're replaced, and our position in business schools, for example, predominantly in the UK. So there are all these kind of challenges about how, as academics, we do work with the labour movement and what support we get for that. Now, the interesting thing that we have in the UK with the Research Excellence Framework is that the work that we do beyond the economy is suddenly being valorised by the state in terms of the money that we get. So the kind of work that people have done for years is now recognised. It's not necessarily celebrated. It's not the thing that people in a business school would put on the headlines or the website to say we're doing this fantastic work with the labour movement to reduce inequality or whatever. But it is now being more supported and recognised. But we don't have those kind of same kind of institutional links where in the past there would be that tradition of people who come through the labour movement, for example, going to Ruskin at college at Oxford, maybe doing a master's degree at Keele or at Warwick, and then kind of getting academic jobs and creating some of those links. But there is a growing interest in the UK around issues around partisan scholarship and how you can be partisan and still objective in the work that we do. And then also more participatory action approaches to doing research with the labour movement. So there's an interest in literature about how individuals can engage in that work. But I thought what was interesting was perhaps the lack of those kind of institutional links that that you maybe have. And I'm quite interested to learn about that for something I'll come on to in a moment. So I think that the book really demonstrates the importance of our work as industrial relations or labour studies scholars inside and outside the economy, and how we can perhaps learn something from that. And obviously in the university, in education, the focus on metrics, publishing in those top journals, doing certain types of research, there are a lot of things that mitigate against us doing these things. So going back to the other kind of key point for me about what the contribution the book makes in terms of laying bare some of the dominant thinking around the current predicament that we find ourselves in. You know, the book is about the future of work, and I always like to think about the futures, plural, of work, and the fact that, and that's a point that you make very clearly, that that this does depend on social relations and the action of different that people take. And also there are many different types of work that we undertake in order to survive on a day-to-day basis and a kind of a generation-to-generation basis and to live well. So there's that rejection of the kind of technological determinism and market fundamentalism. And there is that sense of we've been here before, haven't we? You know, there have been these technological revolutions in the past. Those of us who've been around in university education, I remember in the 1980s, there was a big discussion about new technology. Then we had the knowledge economy. You know, so we go through a lot of these kind of things in the past. I think what's different this time is that, I think as the book rightly points out, we can't see growth as the solution to that. Whereas in the past we'd said, well, yeah, jobs will change. We may lose jobs here, but we'll create more jobs. We'll extract more. And I think one of the most telling comments and most disturbing comments is that in the book was that humanity is pressing against the limits of the Earth's carrying capacity. When I read that, I thought, yeah, that's a very frightening but very accurate way of saying that. So I think if people are not yet convinced, I think the book does lay bare that idea that technology is some independent force. I mean, it's social relations that give rise to certain forms of technology and the way that they're developed and used, and there are lots of chapters that show that. And the idea that markets are natural phenomena. I mean, entrepreneurs might create a market, but markets are defined by governments, they're ordered by institutions, and they're governed by rules and regulations. And anybody who doesn't believe that just has to go to the UK now and see the paperwork that people have to, fill out just to move something from one place to another. You can't get away from that simple fact. And so I think that does demonstrate the way in which, as the book points out, you have to fix all these different things at the same time, the kind of political systems, the social systems and the economic systems as well. Prior to the pandemic, one of the things I was a bit perturbed by with a lot of these kind of debates on the left. I know you said you don't get into all that, but these debates about the kind of post-work world, it is mentioned in some of the some of the kind of chapters. But again, I think COVID is, one of the things I would have liked to see is some kind of, more detail on that, on debunking some of that. I think COVID has presented us with an opportunity to debate, the value of work and the value of different types of work, given the pressures that, essential workers were put under. And again, I thought it would have been interesting, I don't know how much thought you've given to this, about do we need a theory of value? About to kind of value work. And again, it's one thing to criticise the kind of mainstream economics, but then there's those debates about how we might do that. Then the final thing I think is that I'll kind of get back to is the point you made about LERA being a kind of more of a practitioner, as a practitioner as well as an academic association. And one of the things that we've been kind of perturbed by in the UK is the lack of engagement by academics in policy making, and how academics have been written out a lot of those debates. So when we had the Good Work report in the UK, didn't involve, this was supposed to be about what we do about this new category of worker, for example, and all these gig workers. Academics weren't involved in those kind of debates. And one of the things that at Bristol we've just taken over the stewardship of the British Universities Industrial Relations Association, which is the equivalent of kind of LERA for us, is how we actually get more engagement with practitioners, and also get academic research and researchers involved in those public policy debates. So anything we can learn from the US experience would be really welcome. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Ayan. I'm a PhD candidate in political economy at MIT, and my work looks at the political economy of emigration and remittances. So I've had the chance to observe labor in different contexts. So I'd like to thank Toby for inviting me to offer comments on this very important book that you and Todd have edited. Jason Jackson and I recently wrote a commentary on this volume for Labor Studies Journal, and I'll try here to render salient some of the thoughts we had about it, in particular with regards to the need for a global approach to labor studies, but I think within the coordinates of the volume's project, not just as an addition to it, and I'll try to explain that. So in my mind, there are three reasons as to why this book is very important and timely. First, I think it replaces the centrality of labor in the context of interlocking ecological, political, and economic crises, and it does so in its very title, suggesting that the devaluation of work and workers follows a time when they were better valued, which is itself a normative framing that warrants, I think, generative conversations. I think, second, it offers a welcome counter, as Peter said, to a lot of the shibboleths of a determinist future of work literature that sees workers as bound to disappear due to automation in this putative post-work future. And I think that, finally, it offers an epistemological and methodological blueprint for labor studies, inviting researchers to inductively and empirically inquire into labor as it is here and now, while historicizing specific trajectories. And I think this is precisely what my comments will be about, which is asking what trajectories of labor do we foreground, and which political economy histories do we insert them in? If we sketched the object of labor studies at the global scale, what would it look like? And so developing a global labor studies perspective is important, not only for being more inclusive and adding chapters and chapters, but really because doing so strengthens our understanding of the processes of transformation that are underway here in the global north or in the US. So in this comparative study of labor in advanced economies that the volume offers, historically you're broadly tracing the trajectory from Fordism to post-Fordism, where the characteristics of the Fordist labor subject have been eroded by neoliberal labor policies, as you emphasize in the second chapter. And this erosion in your recounting leads to the fading away of the working class, which was the essential political subject of industrial modernity. And however relevant this history is to Europe and Western Europe and North America, it holds some limitations, and it excludes the majority of the workers in the world who are located in the global south. First, it associates the decline of the Fordist working subject with the decline of industry per se, which may mischaracterize what might be a broader global transformation of manufacturing. And further, I think manufacturing has thrived in settings that are quite far removed from the prototypical urban factory model that has characterized Euro-American industrial history. This is the case in South Asia, for example, where informality, rural production, and home-based work have thrived in the construction material and garment sectors. So how does one approach labor studies when the developmental trajectories of the majority of workers around the world, the subject of labor studies, do not match the dominant theoretical frameworks that are based on the experience of the global north? In Western Europe, we all know the proletariat emerged historically through large-scale depeasantization and rural exodus, to the point that now less than 5% of total employment in OECD countries is in the agricultural sector. But this contrasts with the rest of the world, where globally about 45% of the world lives in households where agricultural activity represents the main occupation. And so, as much as we invisibilize the primary sector from the future of work, it's undeniable that it is important to any future of work discussion, regardless of where we're looking at it from. And, although I will concede that this global share of employment in agriculture is trending downwards, the resulting dynamics of depeasantization and deruralization all over the world are not following conventional models of urbanization, industrialization, and proletarization that have defined the discipline of labor studies. We can talk about home-based work, circular migration, semi-proletarization, chronic underemployment, or to use Jan Bremen's term, a footloose labor that has emerged as the global working class norm. And these workers straddle the primary, the secondary, and the tertiary sectors, and at times also straddle class positions, and making it harder to identify what is the subject of labor, what is the working class akin to the one which emerged in the post-war global north as the subject of labor in the Fordist era. So the point I'm trying to make is this characteristic I'm describing are not a departure from a labor norm, but rather the norm throughout the history of capitalism. And the social democratic experience in the 20th century is the outlier in history and at the global scale. And so, if I can reassure you, what I'm suggesting is not a kind of, again, I need to caveat this, it's not a global south whataboutery. For Book, whose avowed goal, as you said, is to focus on the political economy of labor in the US, but rather the idea that looking at this global analytical frame and its histories can shed a significant light on the future of work in the US as well. This is most clearly visible, as Karen Shire said, with the emergence of platform-mediated work, which has remade labor markets throughout the West and the US. And while this is relatively new in the global North, these forms of subcontracted work are very much similar to the norm of informality for urban workers in developing countries. And an interesting point of comparison here is that although urbanization describes very different things, whether you're looking at it in the North or in the South. In the North is both a factor and consequence of the informalization of work, marking really one of the final death knell of the Fordist labor subject that I evoked. Whereas in India, for example, labor studies scholars find that such platforms may be formalizing some areas of work and giving workers increased stability over the medium term. And it changes a lot how we see it. Another thing is that labor practice that would be associated with informal work have crept back into formal work environments here in the global North as well. This is due, obviously, as you say, to large-scale deregulation associated with neoliberal policy paradigms that you outline, but also more fundamentally to new management techniques and workplace surveillance tools. For example, we can cite how technological innovation has allowed for a lot of new strategies that have increased the mental and material hold of the employer over employees, like in Amazon fulfillment centers, because that's the most famous example. And so in discussion about the increasing precarity and devaluation of worker, there is perhaps a tendency to underestimate the impoverishment in working conditions within stable employment contexts. We're kind of missing the forest for the trees in that sense. And arguably, the most important evolutions in advanced economies, labor markets, have been underemployment, gig work, but also, as we talked about before, the rise of the health and social reproductive sectors. And all of these point to a future of work more closely resembling the past and present of work in the global South. The social reproductive sector or the care employment sector are precisely mediated by gendered and racialized relationships of work, overexploited migrants and poor women who have been historically excluded from other parts of the economy are disproportionately bearing the brunt of such exploitation. So if the Fordist moment, there was a better valuation of workers, tapered over more traditional forms of unfreedom associated with wage work, these are re-emerging, pointing to how much unfree and precarious work are congenial really to capitalism, beyond discussions on neoliberalism. And about neoliberalism precisely, and I'll try to end here, if the volume stated goal is to overcome neoliberal dogma about work and workers, then there's really a need for an attentive inquiry into how differently neoliberal policies were promoted and implemented all over the world to better understand which actors were responsible for the devaluing and which social forces could emerge to revalue workers globally. And perhaps, for example, to do that, one would need to overcome a definition in the book of neoliberalism that perhaps straddles too close to market fundamentalism, when in fact we know that neoliberalism requires profound state activism, and that the dichotomy of state and markets, neoliberalism is a theory of state design, of state activism, not about letting the market do whatever it wants. So attention to the different, sheds light on both the structures of opportunity and constraints facing workers in the world, as well as the sets of ideas that are available to combat neoliberal orthodoxy through global and interdisciplinary labor studies. This revaluation, as Professor Karen Shire indicated, should also include explicit attention to the ways that colonial legacies continue to shape labor market institutions, as well as the role of neo-imperial practices and organizations. This book, I think, offers a powerful statement on the value of the field of labor studies in offering an alternative to neoliberal ideas that have shaped contemporary markets and have set the intellectual and policy agenda around the future of work, not just amongst economists, I think, further along as well. A more comprehensive effort to bringing the Global South into these labor studies perspective on the future of work would not only enrich the discussion, as it were, but I think also strengthen the analytic foundation and normative commitments of this adjournment of labor studies that you are calling for. Thank you.
Tobias, do you want to respond? Do you want to stay there and I'll give you the mic, and then we'll? We could do that. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. Let's. Yes.
So first of all, thank you all, because I think the comments are all right on the mark, and I wished they had all three of you had contributed to the volume. It would have been a better volume. But apparently what we wrote was a fertile foundation for lots of smart, reflected engagement that is looking forward. So I really appreciate all of what you have said. I should admit that the volume very much is a piece, and this is what Karen spoke to at the beginning, is a sense of individual making sense of it. I find myself living in Philadelphia, in a labor studies department, and what are we doing here? And what is the we? And what do we do in this society? And so Karen is right on the mark that sometimes there's some overclaiming of what labor studies does. And we probably should be the last people to do this, given that, we don't want to overclaim that we do things that other marginalized groups are doing. So, we should lift up these marginalized groups. But the truth is, too, that labor studies in the US is under pressure, given the hegemony of liberalism, it was 15 years ago that the Wisconsin Labor Studies Industrial Relations program was closed. I don't know, if I look to MIT, I do think that industrial relations is not going to have a huge future there. It's going to be more organizational sociology. So it's all about, the volume in part is about a collective sense-making and an individual sense-making on my part vis-a-vis the collective, and also a claiming of our space, and a claiming also for my younger colleagues who do the work on intersectionality and are the more critical voices. I have a couple of colleagues who just published an article on critical industrial relations. What is it and what can it be? And so it's engaging with that, as well as the reality of COVID. So I would love to talk a little bit more about impact and how impact is measured. I think it's great that in the UK there's at least as a recognition. We at Rutgers, we were founded in the late 40s as an institute to essentially pacify the relations between labor and capital, but the state never funded it. So it's kind of strange because we are actually self-financing all these programs through participation fees, and there's now a push in New Jersey to get some money from the legislature. That is somewhat different from Cornell, where Cornell gets like a line item on the state budget and gets a lot more money. And the UC academics were just successful with getting labor centers expanded into UC Riverside, UC Irvine, UC Santa Barbara. They got a huge pot of money. So hopefully there will be a future for us in state funding in New Jersey. The problem right now is that our junior academics, me included, we had to get tenure on the basis of these metrics that are held in the disciplines. So, and that is okay if you're in kind of a particular disciplinary point, then there are clear norms, but for junior academics that straddle different fields, it's actually very difficult. So, because we in my department don't speak the same language, so it's a lot about how many publications and which journal and just journals and so anyway. So it's then only after tenure that people can do this outreach work. And I have a lot of colleagues that create centers and have these kind of identity challenging tendencies. Pre-tenure, they're all like all academy all the time, and then they become big practitioner-oriented folks. And it would be nice if we, through this claiming of the space and the role of our discipline, our field in society, could create a little bit more continuity and recognize the varied activities that we have. And maybe you already do have that in Britain, but it sounds that it's a struggle all the way through. And Ayan, again, you have convinced me about the global focus. I mean, maybe didn't need to be convinced. I've become ever more aware of my own limitations. I think this whole project was a book that has challenged me in terms of what I write, how I write. Karen is quite right. I mean, the old labor studies, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000, 40 years of history was all about paid labor. I think they were slowly waking up that it was not just paid labor. It's certainly also true for comparative political economy, I mean, which is how I was trained. And it's through the engagement with my younger colleagues and others in the field outside of IR departments that I've been developing language that I think somewhat better represents the challenges and the realities. Clearly, that we have much further to go, and I appreciate all three of you pushing us and pushing the field. And I hope kind of that SASE can also be a space for some of that. And I'm not sure what form that exactly takes, but I'm glad that we're having this type of conversation.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tobias, and all the discussants. Unless you have a burning comment, a response to Tobias, I would open the floor to comments, questions, or even if you have experiences, even if you want to share experiences from your own countries on labor studies, the future of labor studies, or how academia is organized, the labor studies department, that would be really interesting. I haven't read the book fully, so maybe it's in one of the chapters that I missed. But as an industrial relations academic in a business school, in the UK, I agree that I do see my role as industrial relations scholar as a business school as one of challenging the dominant narrative that we have in business school. I think our role is really important because my students otherwise would never hear that there are labor unions or the workers are exploited in the labor market. So at least they get to hear that. But I find in the UK and in a business school in particular, so I think I'm saying the right things. And that my perspective is really important, but I feel that people are just not very interested. So I feel that the dominant discourse is just not there. And also in terms of impact, for those of you who are not familiar with the British system, Brits are obsessed with measuring performance. And one way in which they do it with academics is to check whether our research has had an actual impact and changed perceptions or policies. So in order to prove that you have an impact case that can be submitted to the research excellence framework that the government uses to distribute funding to universities, you actually have to trace the path from your research to the actual change in the policies. And the point is that in the UK, there are very few actors that want to listen to what we say. So I actually feel that we are also disadvantaged because we do impactful research in the sense that we actually talk about things that really happen and that are relevant in the real world. It's just that we do not produce change because we are challenging the existing power relations in society. So I just wonder whether you have also strategies to break this wall and sort of make us challenge the dominant discourse also among our students and in our institutions so that we can sort of stop being frustrated and really feel that we have an impact.
That's probably a question for all of us, or?
Yeah, for any of you with ideas.
Peter, you seem to be successful. Do you want to talk about this, or somebody else?
Well, I mean, as somebody who works in a business school, just on the question in terms of our students, I mean, there are lots of ways that that we try to get students interested in in labour and employment issues. So one of the things that we do with our students at Bristol is we get them to write. If you read Wes, and they have these on the front line pieces. So we get our students to write an on the front line piece as if they were a worker in a particular sector, and we explicitly mark them on the basis of their empathy with those people and their understanding of work in those kind of sectors. We had a really interesting discussion after a colleague from Montreal, who was looking at unions' use of Facebook, and those 4 different types or ways in which. And you thought, wow, what a great project that would be to get your students to look at Facebook, pick a union, look at the way they use social media, because that's what our students love, and to what extent does that tell you about the nature of that union and what it's trying to kind of project. So it's how we go from those kind of, those theories and ideas that we're interested in to kind of make that real for our students. One thing I would say is that when we one of the things we're talking about in a subsequent session was when we talked to a lot of industrial relations academics in the UK, it was quite interesting how many of them teach labour studies on human resource management courses, and how many of them talked about teaching Marxism to students and how they actually relish that challenge, because if they were in a sociology department, they had that sense that maybe the students would be more receptive. So they actually enjoyed the challenge of trying to teach our students critical theory. And they saw it as their responsibility to do that as well, which was interesting as well, rather than just kind of toe the line. But that's about kind of a teaching issue rather than other issues.
I mean, it's a challenge in U.S. academia too. Let me just confirm that a local data point. And Jason, when you were at Wharton Business School in Philadelphia, they still had an industrial relations course. It's gone. All human resources all the time. At Rutgers, at the School of Management and Labor Relations, and we will keep that name management because that's good for marketing purposes. So we clearly have also the issues of appealing, but our dean is thinking about getting away from labor relations, but because we do more than that. It's work and including unpaid work. The way it has proliferated is through third-party funded advocacy. So there's a lot of research centers that are now being staffed by non-tenure track faculty. They're often practitioner professors. So we have a Center for Innovation in Worker Organization. They get a lot of money from the Gates Foundation, from other foundations, and they have programs that are all about impact, about lifting up and training non-white women leaders for the labor movement. So that happens in our school, but it's not what the state funds, and we have to be careful not to use tuition money for it. And so it's also insecure, and the people who work in those roles are also reasonably insecurely employed. I mean, there's no tenure line going into that. I think it works because I have colleagues who, once they have gotten tenure, they have found their practitioner and activist self in themselves. I have a colleague who works on collaborative school reform, and I guess he just does the data. Schools where teachers collaborate about reform has better test scores than if you follow the neoliberal script. And his name is Saul Rubenstein. He publishes on it. He's writing a book on it, and suddenly certainly the Jersey Secretary of Education, but also the National Secretary of Education is paying attention. But he's not doing what would have gotten him the next promotion more quickly. He's doing it because he thinks it's important or because he likes it. And I have a colleague, Janice Fine. I mean, she's essentially training every labor standards enforcement agency in the U.S. Through her work. but it's not systematically supported, and it works because we have a dean who believes in this mission, and I think this volume is also about claiming that space. And I mean, one of the first things I did when we published the book was to send a copy to our university president, so that the last one never visited our school, because we have I think 14 schools at Rutgers, and the last president was there for 6-7 years, and I don't know, I only made it maybe to the 10 biggest. I don't know. We were the second smallest, so he never came by. And like in ranking exercises, the university, of course, wants to be well ranked and get up the non-Jersey student count, and that's why COVID is so bad, because we can't get any more students from China who pay the bills and all of that, and that's why we get into football in the Big Ten, so that we can get more non-Jersey students from other U.S. states, because they pay a higher tuition load. So we benchmark every subject, and Rutgers is really good in philosophy, number 3, in labor history they're really good, but there is no ranking for labor studies or for industrial relations, so they can't rank us. And if they can't rank us, we're not in the strategic plan. So we are invisible. So part of this book is about becoming visible and claiming it. Yeah, I don't know. That's like a roundabout answer of talking to the themes that you are asking us about.
Right. Thank you. Gregory, if you maybe want to introduce. If you want to introduce yourself, I'll bring the mic, or Tobias is gonna do it.
Hello. Yes. Sorry. Gregor Marie from Université de Montréal. I wonder, Toby, if you could speak to the specificity of labor studies in the US, in the sense, I'm trying to think, and this is a comment about elsewhere as well, and you're schooled in comparative political economy, but I'm just trying to think of another country that has labor studies in a US style. And some of it, of course, is related to the creation of extension in US universities in the 1930s. But if we look elsewhere, it's configured in different ways. So I wonder if you'd thought, and clearly you have a basis to think about this in Europe, in the UK, and elsewhere, but also in the global South, and the efforts to create forms of labor studies as opposed to replicating business schools in which you study human resources. I just wondered, any thoughts on this? And all of the panel as well, in the sense that you could think of the UK, you could think of Germany, elsewhere, where in a way you're asking us to think of something, and I'm wondering whether we need to think of how we study labor as opposed to labor studies, if you see what I mean.
Do you want?
I should bring the mic.
Okay, or shall we collect, because there was another question?
Thank you. Very similar question to Gregor, really. If you've got industrial relations, employment relations, labour studies as disciplines, what unites them and what divides them?
And there is a question right next to you. If you could briefly introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, it's not so much a question, but to ask for comments, for comparative comments, and also that response to your question. My name is Guy. I'm the chair of the Labor Studies Department in Tel Aviv. And it's the only labor studies department in Israel, which is a small country, so that doesn't mean a lot. But I think I really share, I'm really happy that I came and learned about this book. I missed it when it came out. It's really an identity search of a department, particularly against the organization, which would really like to market us as human resource department. It would make marketing so much easier. And we would get particularly the master students who come with experience, they really want the hands-on human resource. And we actually object to the terminology of human resource. So some of the professors want to cancel human resource out of the title. And I say, no, we have to keep it for marketing strategies. And the university would really like to market us as pure and simple. And it's a way of navigating in between these two. And it's really getting people, particularly I'm thinking about the master's students, but also for the first degree. It's having people where you know that they're going to, a lot of them are going to work in human resource departments, but having them experience labor studies and not pushing it down their throats, but actually having a course on labor law which is labor-oriented, and having a course on workers' voice, or what's called industrial relations, and making sure that when you talk about work and technology, then it doesn't have to be a Marxist course on law and technology, but you have to bring the labor perspective into talking about technology or globalization, and it's choosing the topics, it's choosing the electives from which they can learn. So it's really somehow creating an environment where you naturalize what we want them to consider to be labor studies. So it's kind of not making this into the explicit mission statement, but it's choosing the right faculty. It's making sure that we have a historian, despite the fact that the provost said, I don't understand why you need a historian in labor studies. How is that related? Making sure that we have a business person as well, because that's also part of the deal and we're not part of sociology. So it's not only we vis-a-vis business, it's we vis-a-vis sociology or other areas. So it's really trying somehow to combine kind of an alchemy of labor studies. But I think it's the right people, it's the right courses, and it's the right message to convey subtly to the students.
Thank you.
I mean, okay, so 2 points to make. So in many US states, as Gregor insinuated, labor studies or this kind of interdisciplinary engagement with labor comes out of labor education. There's a chapter in the book actually on the history of American labor education and what is being taught in these labor education courses. There were very progressive initiatives in the 1920s. One, for instance, at Bryn Mawr, and now an elite liberal arts college that is just rediscovering these like summer schools that were held but that were shut down when they were pushing against gender norms and the interests of industrialists. 50s, 60s, 70s, labor education was, I don't know what the authors call it, but kind of like, I think, tools courses. It was all about managing labor, management relations, and underemphasizing transformational courses. And now they're rediscovering transformational courses. So it's a long-standing field with a dynamic that is with different focal points. The field institutionally represents or finds itself differently in different places. So at Rutgers, Cornell, Michigan State, Penn State, the institutions are reasonably healthy because they have large undergraduate or at least master's programs. In many US universities, there's no teaching component. So they're really dependent on outside funding or funding from the legislature. So the Oregon Labor Center was under threat of being closed down. There are labor centers in the US South. I mean, it's obviously a really hard task. Massachusetts at UMass Amherst doing really important work, and they at least have a master's program that helps them. And now there's actually somebody's, Cedric De Leon, who's the director of that program, is writing a piece on the volume, and he's reflecting on how he is getting leverage for his program and his center by engaging with the critical studies, intersectional organizing that is happening now on gender, race, and decolonialization, etc. So he's claiming that space similarly as we are claiming, maybe overclaiming, for emancipist action. So we also have this tendency that was described for Israel, Penn State, for instance. They are moving to HR, or usually these universities have IR, and HR, and you can see over the last 20, 30 years, they changed the names ever closer to the business world. one observation, and I didn't have a background in this. I got this job, and now I'm trying to understand, well, what is my function? What am I doing? And so the way I understand it at Rutgers was that there was this Institute for Industrial Relations. They had some academics, but also practitioners. And then there was mobilization to do this more critical work in the 60s. And this also then led to the creation of a PhD in labor studies. But that was not with the IR department. That was in the education school. It was about labor education. And then we get the contextual change, Reagan Revolution, neoliberalism rises. Then what was IR becomes HR. I mean, and we become a school, but for a while, IR and HR was this one pole, and labor education, labor studies was here. But HR is growing as business grows in terms of power, and then they kick out IR and kick that over to labor studies. And now our school has an HR department and an labor studies IR department. So it's like as HR grows, IR and labor studies get shoved to the side. And in our school, the tensions are really big, as you know, because we have two departments. One is HR, it's about managing human beings for the bottom line, and then there is labor studies, employment relations, normatively about how human beings can resist such management. And obviously that's kind of difficult in terms of like trying to create a coherent school-wide marketing plan or anything organizational around that. So I think these days, labor studies and IR, to your question, are becoming ever more the same. I think LERA, this organization in the US, I think had this real crisis moment where its membership and attendance at meetings was really low, like 10 years ago, and they've really been broadening themselves. And I think since then, membership has increased and attendance has increased, and there's panels now on critical race theory and industrial relations that wouldn't have existed then. And I see there's a conscious effort being made to talk, to bring non-white people to panels, women to panels. I mean, but and more actively than even I see at SASE. But it's a moving target, and I wonder for myself, will they eventually merge or not, and is this denominational work, does it give us anything? I don't know. This is also kind of, it's thinking through that. That's part of what the volume does. And I don't actually have an answer. It's like, asking questions and seeing how far they get us.
Yeah, we don't really have labor studies in Germany because it's distributed actually through all of the social sciences, law. Maybe the only place we don't find it is in management schools. But of course we have a strong social democratic party. We have a strong labor union movement that funds its own research institute, by the way, out of the very high honoraria that delegates from the labor unions collect on corporate boards of, corporate boards. So it's a completely different situation, which is maybe why Tobias is feeling so much cognitive dissonance within the US context. But it's also maybe why I stressed gender and post-colonial studies, because this is where Germany is very, very weak. I think we still have one of the largest gender wage gaps in Europe. There's no women in management. There's no women on corporate boards of the top 105 companies because it was legislated. But most of them are from the trade union side, not from the management side. We have very high segregation even within our university system. Only 25% of the professors are women, like Ursula and I. And we have extreme forms of discrimination against refugees and the Turkish-German population that the universities are really just beginning to grapple with through so-called diversity programs. But it's pretty systematic, so I don't want to paint the German situation as necessarily better. But we've done very good in integrating class inequality into the economy, perhaps at the expense of other dimensions of inequality. But what does help us, and this is what I really appreciated in the volume, is that we're a completely public education system. We do not charge tuition. We tried to for a little while, and then we took it back in some of the states. We're completely democratic. We elect our deans and our university presidents and vice presidents, and they serve us, not the other way around. There's really very little headhunting, maybe for the chancellors who are the financial officers, but other than that, and I think that is what makes the German higher education system really excellent. And, you know, when I got here, I was like a child in a candy store. I just thought, oh my God, look at this building. It's so beautiful. They've got technology in every room. I mean, the paint is literally falling off the walls in our classrooms. You know, we still use chalk on boards, but in some ways, maybe it's better. Maybe we're a low-growth university system, but it's a democratic system, and you know, we don't have all this fancy high tech, but I think that gives us a different starting point. At the same time, our disciplines do kick back with these metrics, and so far we've avoided it to a great degree. In fact, my department, probably yours too, Ursula, decided not to take part in the national ranking because our methodologists decided that the metrics were wrong. And so the entire German Association of Sociology said, we're not going to let ourselves be ranked, and it was the people from the universities that were highest ranked in the first waves of these that said, no, this ranking system doesn't work. So this is actually, I think, also shows that if you want to, from the bottom up, you can resist these things. Maybe it's much harder in a system that's very top-down, corporatist, as you put it in the book, a corporatist university system, and probably the UK is going this direction too. My colleagues in the UK won't even write a book like this with me because it's an edited volume, and they claim they don't get any credit for it in the ref. So it would be impossible, right?
Yeah, no, what I could say to this and to the question is kind of the answer is in some sense in your book, which is that the category of labor is one, at least in the US, which very much as a subjectivity of people that are workers, laborers, has been completely beaten down in the sense that people, even within our industry, don't even recognize themselves as workers. You know, it is an extremely precarization of the industry, but still for faculty, you know, it is this move that they see themselves as management. UCLA offered an adjunct position for $0, and you know, so there is a sense that people that are driving bicycles to deliver things in America think of themselves as entrepreneurs because they're not employees, they're partners. They're partners of Uber Eats. You know? So I think that there's an answer to that, which is that the category of labor is itself very much contested. And I think that in America, what's interesting compared to Europe or other countries actually is that the labor studies, which is really goes hand in hand with the union movement, but the union movement in America was not its majority coming from a socialist or Marxist kind of background, as opposed to the social democratic parties of Europe. And so in that sense, the American labor movement will display a very different kind of relationship with capital as opposed to European countries. And to extend it, as this gentleman had asked, to other countries in the world and how they do it there, well, it's not the university that does it. So the university will do sociology of work, for example, and then a lot of the things that are done in business schools will be done by corporations themselves. Like, for example, Tata in India funds a number of research on labor, on relationships between management and labor and how to organize a workforce, etc. Because unless there's a strong labor movement to fund these kind of things, these things don't happen. So I think that what I would say is, you know, given the difficulties you have to exist within this kind of like ocean of nomenclatures and struggles, as you said, in Israel to be, are you that attached to the labor studies as a term, or is that something that you feel that you could, do you need that label to be able to do your work? It's a question.
It's a strategic question, and our dean is right now very much engaged in it, because she wants to rename the school, because that whatever labor needs to be renamed. So clearly, she's not going to name it School of Management and Labor Studies. She's not going to do that. So I think the way it usually goes is like work and organization, or something like that, which will be much more individualized, much less collective, much less political. And when I pointed, at least in my view, when I pointed that out, she said, I don't see that. It's like, I do see that though. The good thing is she actually was the president of our university's faculty union. And that makes Rutgers, I have to say, such a special place. We are the highest ranked place that has a faculty union. Brought in the 1950s under McCarthyism, because bad things happened at Rutgers that were not cool, and so they brought the AAUP in, and now the university is stuck with it. And the interesting thing is that now the the faculty union, there's the union for tenure track employees, has joined with the bargaining unit, or the people in the bargaining unit for the non-tenure track folks, and the adjuncts, and the postdocs, and the graduate student employees. I mean, that's really special in the context of US labor relations, that there's an organization that tries to bring in the concerns of all these different status groups. And funnily enough, I don't know, like 20–30% of the people who are in the union leadership are from my department, which somehow makes me quite proud, I have to say. So I don't know, these are open questions and strategic questions. I don't know, so far we are called labor studies, and I thought I speak to that, but I'm not sure how much longer where the future will go.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions? No? Okay, then I will give another round of applause to all our discussants and to Tobias. Thank you very much.